Thank you for tuning in to Stay Sharp with Razor Leaf, your secret weapon for all things digital and manufacturing. In this episode, we welcome Dave Opsahl, the CEO of Actify, who's a long-time industry veteran in the CAD and manufacturing software space. Dave knows a thing or two about program and project management from working with automotive and aerospace and defense customers over the years. Dave explains how program management is much more encompassing than project management and is often misunderstood. Let's listen in with Jonathan, Jen, and Dave as they discuss how program management is a critical factor to customer success.
Welcome back, everybody, to Stay Sharp. It's the podcast about all things digital related to products and manufacturing. I am Jen Ferrillo, and I'm here with my co-host, Jonathan Scott.
Hi, everybody.
Today, we are talking about program management and how it differs from project management. It's easy, doing my research, it was easy to see how everybody can confuse the two. Both involve overseeing and coordinating activities to achieve specific goals within an organization. They use similar technology, and there's definitely overlap in some of the responsibilities, but there are some pretty key differences as well. Joining us today to bring some clarity around the topic is our good friend, and for me at least, past colleague, Dave Opsahl. Dave is the CEO of Actify, a company that has been enabling manufacturers to visualize and engage with their digital product data for decades. Dave, can you give our listeners a little bit of background on yourself and the work Actify does?
Sure. Glad to be here. First of all, thanks for the invitation. I think the topic is interesting and looking forward to digging into it. I've spent my entire career in manufacturing software, in PDM, PLM, supply chain software, quality management, going back, I think the first time I touched a CAD system was before 1980. So I guess that, probably dates me a little bit, but...
That's impressive, though, Dave. That's very impressive.
That I survived that long?
CAD before 1980 is exciting.
It's been a great career. Actify is kind of a good place for me to put a period on the career. I hope to be retiring pretty soon, but the company has been around for more than 20 years. It was built around a single product called Spinfire, which was a tool that we gave to companies that needed to digest the kind of dense information that CAD systems produce, but without the expense of acquiring a license to that CAD product that created that and the training and the rest of the investment that goes along with that. Somewhere around, I think it was around 2013 or so, the company at that point in time, this was before I joined in 2019, the company, at that point in time was getting a lot of requests from people to help them manage the kind of data that they were getting and using Spinfire to access. And that resulted in building a platform called Centro. And in 2019, one of the challenges we had is that platform wasn't selling particularly well. So we took the time to, go out and talk to the customers that were using it. A lot of them were asking to have bespoke extensions built to Centro for their specific purpose. And we learned pretty quickly that most of them first were in a common industry, the automotive industry in this case, and then they were all trying to do the same thing, just different pieces of the same
Not as
thing.
unique as they thought.
What's that?
Not as unique as they thought.
No, they're not as, the interesting thing was Actify thought they were all unique, but the customers didn't. Which brings us to probably the first point, which is you got to listen to the customers, and it turned out to be a pretty interesting learning experience around program management. Some of the things that automotive suppliers were struggling with that are representative, I think, of any program-based industry, whether you're talking aerospace and defense, industrial machinery, medical devices, all of those kinds of things that really have that program element to them. Yeah, we learned a lot from that experience. Yeah,
I think that's a good thing that I want to underline quickly, right? Because I think some of the topic, when folks hear the topic, they could immediately jump to, oh, well, I don't know if this is really relevant to me. My industry is not like, be careful about that, right? Because I think this concept is common across a lot of industries, maybe with different terminology, right? But anywhere where there is some sort of OEM, vendor, supplier, network supply chain kind of situation, I think this topic's very relevant. It's just some industries, maybe it's a little more evolved than others. They use a little different language, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and I think there's also a tendency, depending on what your role is in the company, to sort of have blinders on when you look at, how important should that be, to me, or you put your own particular slant on it, and I think that's especially true of those of us that have spent most of the time on the engineering side rather than on the manufacturing side. That's just a bias I think I've seen my entire career. So
I totally agree. There's lots of those, where you get sort of that focus and those blinders on about how you see a problem because of where you sit.
Yeah, exactly.
So Jonathan, you bring up an interesting point that, like, a lot of times it's the terminology. Maybe they don't call it program management. So let's start where we usually do, where let's define, okay, when we're talking about program management here, what are we talking about? And how is it different than project management? Because I feel like project management is a little bit more well known as a term.
Well, I think, for me, when I think about, let's just take a car, because that's what we've been dealing with, recently. But, the car is a complex product, obviously. You could argue that, an aircraft maybe has a higher level of complexity, but, it is not a bicycle. It's a pretty complex, product that's being produced out of that. And when I think about the program, I'm thinking about everything that's required from the delivery of raw material at the bottom of the supply chain all the way up to finished parts arriving just in time, at the point of assembly. And that program encompasses everything in there. It isn't just about the design of the thing that has to be built. It's about the procurement side of it. It's about the, quality assurance side of it. It's all the pieces of that. The program covers all those points. Inside that program, you have lots of different projects that go on, right? And those projects tend to be, siloed depending on, the functional capability, of that part of the company. But they will be running or executing a project inside this bigger program. And to me, that's the difference between the two. Right.
Right. And to your point, Dave, that breakdown of a program into its many constituent projects can take many forms, right? Maybe it's functional. Maybe it's by area of the product. Oh, this is, drivetrain kind of product or project, or, certain areas of the product. Certain functional areas. Oh, that's a prototyping. That's an engineering. That's an industrialization, So, yeah, it makes perfect sense, I think. And I agree with that definition. I'm glad you took that crack at it, that program is much more encompassing. And there are sometimes more elements to it than you think of in a traditional project, too.
Yep.
Well, and I think one thing that you didn't bring up is the suppliers as well, right? So they've got... It's very not disjoint exactly, but it's separate from what you're building in-house. So they've got their own projects. So that's another way to break things down.
Yeah, it's interesting when you think about, all the conversation that goes on in the industry about a digital thread, and yet you see how difficult it can be within any one of those small projects, let alone the entire program, of how do you keep a thread going when all of those things are, disconnected to some degree. And, I think that one of the things that we learned out of, pushing into that program management area is that the technology has changed enough so that there's things like enterprise automation that can, enable that sort of connectivity that didn't, 5, 6, 7 years ago wasn't there. Or if it was custom development and you bore the maintenance expense of that. Today we don't need to do that. Yeah.
That's a great point, Dave. Bringing digital thread into this conversation, right? Because, again, listener could easily think, oh, they're talking about project program management. That's the execution of things. How's that tying back to what we talk about on this podcast with, all things digital and digital thread? And they're so directly connected to your point, right? You can think about people doing projects and they want to have a digital thread inside their four walls for their project. But then it gets really hard to have a digital thread for the overall program when, like Jen, you mentioned, that spans supplier A, supplier B, OEM, multiple tiers. Those things are really hard to maintain. And, to your point, Dave, the tech is getting better and helping us, but it's still hard.
Yeah, it is. One of the other things that we learned out of that effort was that, and it was actually kind of by accident. That might sound a little pejorative, but it turned out that the technology that Actify chose to put into that platform really was a key to being able to address that program management challenge. So I think a big issue for companies in the past has been, if you think about the program at that Uber level, at the top, and think about for something as complex as an automobile or car, that if you start thinking of a data model of how you would have to capture all the relevant information for that program, it isn't a simple set of relationships. It's incredibly complex. There are literally thousands, of individual decision points, individual tasks that have to be done. You think about the number of people that are involved, the different roles that they have. How do you, there's this web of connected information out there that you need to be able to capture, be able to access, be able to model it. And, a lot of the traditional technology out there just doesn't fit the bill for that. But, things like, a lot of the tech's very similar to what's underneath Facebook, for instance. So if you think about all the ways that
okay, that's scary.
I know. But, there's a whole class of database technology that really social media has taken advantage of and really developed those tools. And using them for manufacturing software turned out to be a pretty easy thing to do. But that was a choice that they made back in 2013, a really fortuitous one, I think, to be able to do that.
And for our listeners there, Dave, you're talking about using graph database technology, right, those kinds of things where the social media companies saw the benefit of that because they knew what they were managing is relationships, right? Tons and tons of relationships. And here, to your point, I think you guys had the foresight, or maybe fortuitous, but, foresight to see, a lot of what we're doing is really about those relationships. And so that fits really well in this model. And to your point, I think PLM and the industry, digital industry, people are starting to catch on to that more now. You guys were just, sort of a lead of the pack on that observation.
Yeah, it was really exciting to see some of the things that we could do with that surprised a lot of people, I think. So we're pretty curious to see what more we can do with it, I think, moving forward.
I want to go back to something that you mentioned a second ago, Dave, because I think it's an important observation for a lot of folks who look at digital thread and say, yeah, I like that concept. It's a really good concept. And I'll say I'm guilty myself of this, is I very quickly think about it as sort of a digital thread of the product record. What are the things that define the product, the bills of material, the CAD, the analysis, all those things. But many people are specific, or let me say that again. Many people are right to point out it's more than just that. It's also the context around it. It's the decisions that get made. It's the activities that came to those decisions. It's the change in approval workflows and comments people made along the way. And that's where this topic today, talking about program management and that web around the product, it connects right back to that, right? That's why I think it's such a good topic for us to be talking about, because you guys saw that. You see the need for tracking it all, but then keeping it, remembering how did we get where we got to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's a really important point. You think about, in the automotive industry, you think about battery technology, right? And if you are the OEM, the automotive OEM, you ought to be concerned about where are the materials going into those batteries coming from, right? So the whole thing about conflict minerals, for instance, you need to be able to trace where that was sourced from. And that information needs to live along with everything related to the design of the product. It's just a non-design related piece of context, to your point, I think. And again, having the ability to keep that stuff in a form that allows you to access it, because you just don't know who's going to need to ask the question. And if that stuff is all siloed off in different systems, that's where people start to run off the rails. You have no ability to, do that tracing, figure out where it came from. Or if you do, it's this inordinately complex effort to go through a bunch of documents, a bunch of paper. Why not be able to connect that information and make it easy to access? And that was, something we saw happen, with the program management solution, is that if you connect the way that people are managing the program to the actual work being done, instead of having it living in another system, now you can start to deliver a product that people can actually use, and that gets to be a big deal as well. If it's something that requires in the supply chain, once you get below the top, the top 5 or 10%, people, tend to do things let's call it on a shoestring,
right,
for a better word, and so, it's easy to understand how somebody could start to keep track of program milestones in something like Project or Excel that's completely disconnected from, the work that they're actually doing. That just didn't make any sense. Once you combine those two things, then a lot of that work gets done automatically for the person without them even knowing it's happening. If you connect the document to, for instance, to the task, all right, when the document changes, you can inform everybody involved in that task that the document's changed. So it's like there's pieces of document, or content management attached to that. There's pieces of scheduling attached to that. And we've just never seen something that is specific to something like program management where you can connect all that stuff. We didn't find anything out there that would do that.
Yeah, I love this take on that part of digital product definition, right? Because on this podcast and previous episodes, we spent a lot of time talking about PLM, right? And we've got a PLM bias. We know that.
We do.
A thing we know something about. And PLM can take a very sort of product record sort of perspective on digital product. And what you're talking about is, let's change the angle on that. Let's look at it from over here. Let's look at it from the activity that we need to do to define it and see that web.
Almost like let's look at it from above, from the 10,000 foot level, so that we can see all of the things that are affecting it. I mean, so the complexity is a lot higher than a simple project, right? There's just a lot more. When you get up to that level, there's just a lot more that you're aware of to control and manage.
Well, coming at it from the work we're doing perspective as much as the work output we create, right? That's one of the things I think is so interesting about how you guys looked at the problem and saw the problem, and how your customers that you talked to saw the problem and said, all right, well, let's tackle it from that angle.
Yeah. It turned out that, another benefit of some of the choices that we made on the technology side was, going back to the traditional PLM way of doing things. If you have something that you'd like to add to the data model in a typical PLM system, that's a non-trivial thing to do. You have to actually decide what to do with it, how you're going to treat it. But the relationships that get modeled in a graph database, you have a lot more freedom to be able to let somebody make a change without necessarily having to go through that kind of exercise. So, for instance, in the automotive industry, at least in the U.S., there's a lot of emphasis around. There's a process called APQP, in the automotive industry that's very stage specific. And a lot of the OEMs want the suppliers to be able to follow that. And the OEMs will slightly modify that process for their own purposes. But within each supplier, there's things that they do that they think are part of their expertise, part of their competitive advantage, that they do things a little differently than the next guy, or at least they think that. So they want to be able to change or add or model that process change. What's different about standard APQP as it comes out of AIAG, and make those changes. We made it possible for someone to do that without having any coding knowledge, with just a few clicks to be able to say, yeah, we'd like this to be able to, be an extra step, in that part of the process. That turned out to be a very necessary thing to do, because if you're trying to force someone to alter their process to fit your tool, and we all know this, okay, but it just got really hard to build a product that enabled you to do that, right? Well, that's not that hard anymore if you make the right choices.
So Dave, I'm going to ask you to back up just a second. Mm-hmm. You got a rule. You can't introduce acronyms without explaining them. What's APQP? For everybody not in the automotive, what does APQP stand for?
Oh, you're going to ask me a tough question. I struggle to remember the 4 letters, let alone... I think it's Automotive Program Quality Assurance, I think is what it stands for, literally.
Okay.
I thought it was, and again, we can edit whatever we want to here. I thought it was Advanced Part Quality Planning or Product Quality Planning. I thought.
Well, one of us is right. I'm sure, but basically that's what it is. It's a way of standardizing, the process of producing a component, so that the OEM in this case basically knows how you built it. Okay, what records you kept. APQP a lot of times is considered in the domain of QMS, so quality management systems.
Okay.
Is where that comes from. So, things like first article inspection, a lot of that are all part of that process. Yeah.
And I think the thing that's so interesting about it from the perspective we're talking about today, right, and Dave, why it's such a logical fit for program management is a lot of I guess OEMs or people who are making a product through a network, a supply chain network. It's a way of standardizing the sort of the cadence and the steps we go through to make sure everybody's on the same page, doing things the right way, so that when you're done at the end, everything works, right? Like the things I remember from APQP are, okay, let's have our quality plan. How are we going to make sure that the part comes out like I need it to come out? How am I going to make sure my process produces the part I expect it to produce? And what are the checkpoints along the way? Like you said, first article. Did the first one come out all right? Okay. How often are we going to sample as we're ramping up? And how are we going to check to make sure at rate things stay the right quality? And those kinds of things, right?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And there's certain documentation requirements that go along with it. There's information that as a supplier you have to provide as part of the program, requirements. So, but it's just crazy the extent to which some people try to do this just with manual tools. It's amazing to me, to be in an industry where you are given a lot of times just a couple of weeks to make a firm price delivery commitment and margin. That's another thing that's different about that industry is you have to commit to a certain margin. And what that typically means for a supplier is that if you're going to screw up, it's going to come out of your margin out of that, right? And there's a lot of ways that design changes, try to get recast as screw ups, but, that's probably pretty typical in any industry, I think. But, this whole program management, area, one of the things that was just remarkable is the horror stories that we would hear, especially as we went through the pandemic, about the impact that function can have, on people's lives. There was one company we talked to where, somebody actually, committed suicide because of the pressure. That was just a horrible story to hear. And you have these people, a lot of times they have years of experience, within the industry, if not within that company. And here they are sitting between the OEM customer and everyone else downstream of them, both internal to their organization, but then suppliers beneath them. And you have the responsibility to keep that program on schedule, but you have absolutely no authority to do anything. Your job is basically you're trying to be the conductor of this orchestra, but you're forever, 3 or 4 bars behind where the musicians are, because you're always behind, always behind. You never know moment to moment what's the status of that program.
So I think there are 2 things to dig into there, because the timing. I want to talk about the timing and how basically that's how to keep that as up to date as possible, or if that's one of the challenges. But then I think there was another thing that I think you had written an article maybe last year in Forbes about the human resource side of it, is that these program managers there are fewer and fewer of them these
Right.
days. And I don't know, is it a generational thing? Are people moving out of it? Is it because it's too stressful? What's the take on that?
Well, there's a lot of movement, a lot of moving from one company to another company within that function, and I think the stress is a big part of that. I think that one of the things that was a little perplexing to us was that in a survey that we did before we started doing that development, we had a double-blind independent study done. I think it was about 140 or 150 automotive suppliers across 3 countries. And one of the questions we asked them are you planning any changes, improvements in your program management area? And kind of a second order question to that, and do you have executive support for that? And it was something over 90% of the respondents. So there was 1 respondent per company. Company had to be at least 50% of the time their business was in the automotive supply chain. And the person responding had to be a participant in the program management area, right? Over 90% of them said that they were, right? But then if you ask them another question, which we did, that said, do you consider yourself to be world-class in that? Same 90%, roughly, said that they thought they were world-class in that. So it's a little bit of a disconnect, I think. And there was a reason why I was tying this back to what you said, Jen.
We're talking about the human resources and people moving, are they moving out of it? Yeah.
Yeah. So I think is partly a function of that, of the stress, that goes on there. And I think that you have a situation where the people that are most effective in that, are effective in it, because they've had the experience. They typically have had multiple roles. They might have spent time in engineering, but also spent time in manufacturing. Okay. And so they have at least some insight into the different processes, knowing what questions to ask. So I think another reason why it's a human resource problem is that it's a very experience-intensive thing to be able to do. One of the experiences we had with the first company that went live with the program management solution is they were able to bring new people in and train them how to do that because the system took care of so much of what used to be delivered via experience. So, and that again is, I think, one of the things that, if you can put the right set of tools together, put the right solution together, you can really take away a lot of the knowledge that needs to be there, because you're giving people a framework within to execute that job, right? They don't have to manually be thinking about it. The system's guiding them through what's the next step, what is it that I have to do next, and making it very easy for that person to make a decision. So typically what we heard was the amount of time it took to bring somebody up to speed in a program management role was somewhere around 14 to 18 months was what they normally...
I thought you were going to say years.
14 to 18 months. So, anything you can do to substantially reduce that is a huge benefit. And it also allows you to bring people in that might be really sharp, just don't have, a lot of that shop floor experience that you might want to see.
I think that's a great point you're making, Dave. And I'm going to extrapolate it for the broader context, right? So outside of program management and into this broader digital product world, that a lot of benefit that people can bring when they get the right system that sort of fits the process well it's that framework. It's the training wheels for when you need to deal with, the aging of your workforce or the shifting of your workforce or whatever it is, that these digital frameworks can give you those guardrails, give you those training wheels to help bring people on.
Yeah. No, it's I think, we kept asking ourselves why somebody hadn't built a solution like this before. That was something we kept, ruminating on, because it was like, did nobody do this because it can't be done? Why is that? And I think there's a big part of that answer that goes to what we were talking about earlier. It was the tech side of it. But the rest of it too, I think, is that just like it is in design engineering, probably the same if you're doing, offline programming on the shop floor, there's a set of expectations that new people coming into the workforce have about what is it that I'm going to have as tools to be able to do my job, right? So going back to Jen's, comment about the workforce side of this, I think another thing that was, involved in that, in that observation is the fact that if you're trying to bring somebody, who's coming out of school, so somebody, let's just say in their mid-20s, and if they've been, using modern tools, in their education, and then you throw them into a role that basically says, you're kind of a glorified coordinator here, and, your tool set is call these people, get the status update, and change that cell in the Microsoft Excel spreadsheet that represents, the program status. It just, you think about that, and somebody coming out of a modern, educational experience would go, this is nuts.
I would say it's not even just the modern educational experience, right? It's the digital experience these days. You mentioned social media. I mean, because I have several kids just came out of college or coming out of college now. Like, they come out of college, like, they're trained to they want to know instantly. They got the information that they need at their fingertips the moment they want it. So I think that was one of the challenges we talked about here is, you had mentioned that once you find out the information, you call and you find out, it takes you 24 hours to get that information. Yeah. By that point, it's out of date.
Yep.
So, and that's a thing that I don't think comes out in projects necessarily, because projects are more discrete and everybody's more fairly aware of where they are in their project. Mm-hmm. But when you've got an assembly of projects, nobody's necessarily looking at how to coordinate that. And I think that's a large part of what you're talking about with regard to program management versus project management.
Yeah. Yeah, I
love the connection we made to social media here, right? I mean, I know we made initially talking about technology behind the scenes, but you're exactly right? When you think about, when you mention kids, I think about my kids and how would they tolerate social media update lags of 24 hours? I mean, that's preposterous.
They can't even not text back immediately. So.
I've got an 18-month-old grandson that already knows how to operate a mobile device at 18 months.
It doesn't surprise me. It doesn't surprise me because my grandkids, even the one that's under a year, when he hears the FaceTime sound, will turn around, because my daughter FaceTimes me every morning. Will turn around and smile at her phone because he knows he's on camera. Yeah. So, but I mean, it's great to see how. I mean, we've talked on past things about how the gaming industry has driven digital technology, and I think it's really cool to learn how, because you mentioned the databases, et cetera. that are behind, for instance, Facebook being similar. I think it's great to see the way that the digital industries are coming together. It's not just, to your point, it's not all just about engineering.
Yeah. I think I wonder why, some of the large established PLM companies haven't done more to embrace, that kind of new technology. And I think, for them, it's been the same problem as it always has been, for any company like that. You get a system, out there that is selling well, you get a customer base built up, at some point, especially if you're a public company, you do not want to mess with that too much. Well,
and those are big systems we're talking about. It's like turning a Titanic, or not the Titanic, that's perhaps a bad example. Turning any big steamship or any big cruise ship, you can't do it easily, and look at the users of those systems. Yes, we do have new folks coming into the workforce, but a lot of the users of those big PLM systems are of a certain generation, like mine, or just behind me, where, I think this might be a case where engineers have actually been part of the problem when you're talking about why wasn't technology developed to handle this earlier? It's because, engineers are really good at making things work with the technology they have.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Ain't broke, don't fix it. So it looks like, I'm just trying to keep an eye on time here. It's usually one of my tasks. So I need to start suggesting we wrap up, but I feel like we've barely scratched the surface here. So hopefully, Dave, you will be willing to and able to join us again. It seems like right now we've uncovered a lot of similarities between basically the tasks of program and project management and the goals and objectives, but there are a lot of significant differences, primarily in, I think, scope and level of view and amount and type of data, really. And certainly some of the challenges. I feel like we've just barely touched on the challenges and how we're addressing it. So maybe we can have you back and dig in a bit deeper on how the technology is now enabling us to get a better handle on all of this in the future and where we might be headed after that. So
would love to.
And I'll say I would love to dig in too when we come back to this. Some of the observations that you have, Dave, about things that you guys learned with this different perspective, right? I mean, I think there's a lot of things we do around product digitalization today that are sort of the traditional way we look at it with PLM and connecting to the golden triangle, MES and ERP and getting downstream. And, we look at it from sort of the model we've had. And you guys looked at it from a different model. And I think that's really instructional and informative to our audience to think about on their product digitalization journey. Sometimes you got to come at it from a new angle to get a new result and a better result. So I'd love to dig into that more too.
Yeah, I agree.
That would be a great conversation to have.
It's kind of taking the golden triangle up to a prism, a triangular prism.
There we go.
3D.
Not now, but sometimes I have to explain the golden triangle to me. So.
Absolutely.
All right.
But not now.
All right. Well, Dave, thank you very much for joining us. And Jonathan, of course, for co-hosting. I want to thank all of our listeners as well, and let us know if there's something. Obviously, we're going to plan an additional one on program management. If there's anything you want to hear that you didn't hear, any questions you have in this, and or any other topics you'd like us to discuss, reach out to us on social media. You can find us on pretty much anywhere you can find a podcast these days, as well as YouTube. And until next time, stay sharp.
See you, everybody.
Thank you for being here and listening to this episode of Stay Sharp with Razor Leaf. If you have any lingering questions from this podcast, we'd love to answer it for you. Just leave us a comment on our post or send an email to podcast@razorleaf.com. We appreciate all the feedback we receive. And don't forget to subscribe to our podcast on your favorite podcast platform or on our YouTube channel. Until next time, stay sharp.